When we speak about emperors, kings, or rulers of the past, we often imagine the brilliance of their thrones, the sacredness of their ceremonies, and the divine aura with which they surrounded themselves. But there are stories so strange, so incomprehensible to the modern mind, that even the chroniclers of the time recorded them in whispers, afraid that one day posterity would mock them as legends or condemn them as blasphemies. One such story is the heavenly marriage of an emperor and his own son. At first glance, this sounds like a fabrication, a rumor born from the malice of political opponents or the fantasies of those who hated the imperial dynasty. Yet the records persist. They lie in manuscripts, fragments of chronicles, and in the testimonies of men who swore they had seen the rituals with their own eyes. To dismiss these records would be to silence history itself. And so, we must begin carefully. What was this ritual, and why did it happen? The ritual is described as a marriage of the heavens, an act by which the emperor bound his son to himself, not only by blood, but by the sacred union of divine power. It was not a marriage in the common sense. No feast of bridesmaids, no golden rings exchanged under church blessing, but rather a secret rite, conducted in the stillness of night, when incense thickened the air, and the emperor, dressed in celestial robes, placed his son opposite him as though he were both groom and bride. For centuries, scholars have debated whether this act was symbolic, mystical, or, as some heretical sources suggest, deeply carnal. The truth, as is often the case, is hidden in the layers of conspiracy and secrecy that surround the imperial court. But before we reveal the darker interpretations, we must understand the context. The empire of which we speak was not like modern kingdoms, bound by constitutions and rational laws. It was a world in which rulers were perceived as living gods. The emperor was not simply a man, he was the axis of the cosmos, the bridge between earth and heaven. His body was thought to contain the harmony of creation, and his bloodline was not merely political, it was divine. To preserve that divinity, extraordinary measures were taken. Incestuous unions were not unheard of in ancient courts. Pharaohs of Egypt married their sisters, believing this union kept their blood pure. In Rome, whispers of emperors abusing their daughters and sons filled the writings of their enemies. But the heavenly marriage went further still, because it was cloaked in a ritual language of sacredness, giving what would otherwise be called perversion, the aura of transcendence. Imagine the scene. The emperor, already advanced in age, feared his death. His son was young, strong, but untested. To simply leave him the throne was not enough. Power was fragile, constantly threatened by generals, priests, and ambitious courtiers. Thus, the emperor devised a rite that would make his son not merely heir, but part of himself. The marriage was supposed to fuse their souls, making rebellion against the son tantamount to rebellion against the emperor himself. It was, in essence, a spell woven into politics. Yet not everyone accepted this vision. Secret opposition grew inside the court. High priests whispered that the emperor had overstepped the boundary between divine mystery and abomination. The Senate murmured that the people would never accept such rites if they were revealed. And perhaps most dangerously, the son himself began to doubt. For what dignity could he hold, being forced into the role of both bride and child? Was he being honored or enslaved beneath the shadow of his father? Here we arrive at the first revelation. The ritual was not a spontaneous invention. It was planned, rehearsed, and carefully hidden from the eyes of the world. Documents suggest that before the ceremony, the emperor ordered the destruction of certain religious texts that might be used against him. He rewarded astrologers and prophets who claimed to see omens favorable to the union, and he punished dissenters with exile or execution. A web of conspiracy surrounded the throne, tightening like a noose upon all who questioned his actions. But history has its own way of punishing secrecy. Fragments of the truth leaked out. A chronicler in a distant province recorded rumors that the emperor had taken his son as a wife before the gods. Another, more daring, wrote of unholy embraces beneath the sacred canopy. These accounts were swiftly suppressed, yet they survived in copies smuggled by monks and hidden in monastery libraries. From them, we learn that the so-called heavenly marriage was not merely symbolic. It had gestures, vows, and even consummation, though whether this consummation was physical or only ritualistic remains the darkest question of all. To understand why such extremes were taken, one must also know the atmosphere of fear that reigned in the empire. Enemies were not only foreign invaders, but also internal rivals. Brothers killed brothers, fathers killed sons, and mothers poisoned their own children to secure power. Within this world, the line between love and violence, between piety and corruption, blurred into nothingness. If a ruler believed that marrying his son could preserve his dynasty, who among his terrified subjects could oppose him? And yet, opposition did exist. Later sources claim that a secret faction within the palace sought to use the scandal of the marriage as a weapon. These conspirators hoped that once the ritual was revealed, the emperor would be declared mad and the throne taken by another branch of the family. In their letters, preserved in fragments, they speak of breaking the sacred bond with shame. But they underestimated the cunning of the emperor, who turned accusations into proof of his divinity. Yes, he is said to have proclaimed, "I unite with my son, for in him lives the second son, the double light of our eternal empire." To many, this sounded like madness. To others, it was terrifying genius. Thus, the first act of our tale closes not with clarity, but with mystery. We know that the emperor married his son in a ritual he called heavenly. We know that conspiracies were already circling, and that truth and blasphemy were intertwined like serpents devouring each other's tails. The question remains, was this rite an act of divine symbolism or the ultimate corruption of power? And more importantly, what consequences did it unleash upon the empire? These answers belong to the next part of our story, where we shall descend deeper into the hidden chambers of the palace, uncovering testimonies of those who served in silence, and revealing what truly happened after the so-called heavenly marriage was performed. Update 1. The emperor's heavenly marriage did not vanish into the void of secrecy as he had hoped. No matter how carefully he silenced dissent, no matter how many scrolls he burned or witnesses he rewarded, a ritual of such magnitude could not be hidden forever. The palace, after all, was a living organism. Corridors carried echoes, servants carried glances, and rumors were as inevitable as shadows cast by a flame. It began with the priests. Among the empire's religious elite, there was division. A small faction, bound to the emperor by gifts and promises, declared the ritual holy. They claimed it was the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy, the union of two sons, the merging of father and son into one eternal flame that would never die. These priests crafted hymns, obscure and esoteric, that spoke of the doubled light of the heavens and the groom who is also the child. But other priests recoiled in horror. They saw in the ceremony not sacredness, but blasphemy. For them, the emperor's act was not a divine union. but a corruption of cosmic law. One priest, whose testimony survives in fragments copied secretly in a monastery centuries later, wrote, "I was summoned to witness the night of the union. The emperor stood in garments of gold and blue, and his son was adorned in robes of white as though he were both bride and sacrifice. They stood before the altar of fire. The emperor placed his lips upon the boy's brow, and words were spoken that no scripture approves. I departed before the conclusion, for my soul trembled. If this is heaven's will, then heaven itself has been defiled." These words, preserved despite relentless efforts to destroy them, reveal how the ritual appeared to those not bound by loyalty. It was not merely symbolic in their eyes, it was an abomination that tore the fabric of faith. Inside the palace walls, whispers spread among the servants. They alone knew the smallest details: who entered the imperial chamber, who left it trembling, what garments were prepared, what perfumes burned through the night. And servants, unlike priests or senators, were too numerous to silence. Some claimed the son wept during the ritual, others that he resisted but was forced into submission. Still others swore that after the ceremony, the emperor declared before his closest advisers, "Now he is mine twice, by blood and by heaven. None shall tear him from me." The conspiracy against the emperor found nourishment in these whispers. Senators, generals, and ambitious relatives of the dynasty began to meet in secret. To overthrow an emperor was no small task, for his power extended into every province, and his spies were everywhere. But to accuse him of madness, of sacrilege, this was a weapon that could rally the masses. The conspirators believed that, if they revealed the truth of the marriage, the people would rise against their sovereign. Yet, in this hope, they miscalculated. The emperor was no fool. He had anticipated rebellion and prepared accordingly. To the people, he presented the marriage not as an unholy act, but as a mystical safeguard. He declared publicly that the empire now had two sons, two living embodiments of divine order. "When I pass," he proclaimed, "I will not die, for my spirit is fused with my son. He is not merely heir, but continuation. In him lives my eternal reign." Many, fearful of divine wrath, accepted this explanation. Superstition weighed heavier on the hearts of the people than outrage. To oppose the emperor now seemed not only treason, but rebellion against the gods themselves. And so, while senators schemed and priests whispered, the streets of the capital echoed with chants of loyalty, orchestrated by imperial propaganda. But the son, the silent figure at the center of it all, grew restless. Sources describe him as torn between duty and revulsion. On the one hand, he was bound by fear of his father, whose gaze alone could silence any objection. On the other, he felt shame and rage at being reduced to a symbol of ritual. The marriage was supposed to elevate him, yet it chained him more tightly than ever. He could not act freely, for every gesture was interpreted as an extension of his father's will. Here lies the second great revelation. Some conspirators began to approach the son himself. In hidden chambers, under the guise of loyalty, they whispered, "The emperor has shamed you. He has used you for his sorcery. Join us, and you will rule as a man, not as a shadow." Whether the son accepted these whispers is still debated. Certain chronicles suggest that he listened, though cautiously, and that in his heart he yearned for freedom. Others claim he remained loyal, even submissive, until the end. What is certain, however, is that his presence became the pivot of the struggle. The conspirators needed him. Without his silent approval, their claims of corruption would lack weight. With him, they could ignite rebellion. Meanwhile, omens began to disturb the empire. The sky darkened with eclipses, earthquakes shook the provinces, and famine gnawed at the people. To some, these were signs of divine anger at the emperor's blasphemy. To others, they were proof of the prophecy fulfilled, that heaven itself had shifted because of the union of two suns. Priests battled with words, senators with plots, and generals with daggers hidden beneath cloaks. One particularly chilling testimony comes from a soldier stationed near the palace, preserved in a brittle letter. "We hear strange sounds at night from the imperial quarters. Some say it is the voice of angels, others that it is the lament of spirits. The young heir walks among us with a face pale as the moon. The emperor, however, glows with a fire unnatural, as though the union has given him new life. Men fear to speak, yet all feel that doom approaches thus." By the end of this second chapter, the empire teetered between faith and rebellion. The emperor had bound his son to himself in a marriage meant to secure eternity, yet in doing so, he had sown seeds of conspiracy that now spread like wildfire. The court trembled under suspicion. Every whisper could be betrayal. Every priest, every servant, every senator might carry a dagger of truth. The empire had not yet fallen, but cracks had begun to appear in its marble walls, and soon those cracks would widen into catastrophe. For no ritual, no matter how carefully cloaked in sacred words, can escape the judgment of history. Update 2. By the time the second year after the heavenly marriage began, the empire was a realm of suspicion. Every corridor of the palace breathed fear, and every banquet hall echoed with false smiles, hiding sharpened intentions. The emperor, convinced that his ritual had secured eternity, moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Yet behind the silk curtains of loyalty, conspiracies grew like mold in darkness. The senators were the first to sharpen their daggers. Outwardly, they praised the emperor, repeating the mantra of two suns, one eternal flame. Inwardly, they were outraged. The ritual had not only mocked their traditions, but had placed the empire in peril. Foreign envoys had begun to whisper of the mad emperor who weds his son, and neighboring rulers prepared to exploit the scandal. To allow such an abomination to stand was, in their eyes, to invite chaos. The generals, too, were restless. Soldiers who marched under the banner of discipline now murmured of omens. Some believed the emperor had summoned divine wrath upon the land. Others saw weakness in his obsession with mystical rituals. Armies cannot be led by superstition, the generals reasoned, and thus they too looked for opportunity. The priests, however, were divided. Some clung desperately to the emperor's version of events, claiming the ritual was divine. Others whispered that the empire was cursed. Secretly, those who opposed him began sending letters to monasteries and distant provinces, preserving testimonies that would later survive the emperor's relentless censorship. These documents, brittle with age, tell us how dangerous it was to resist him. Many priests who raised their voices vanished, their names erased from the rolls. The few who survived wrote only in riddles, as though truth itself had to wear a mask. And at the center of it all was the sun. The bridegroom of the heavenly marriage became the most watched figure in the empire. His silence was more eloquent than words. To some, his bowed head meant obedience. To others, it was the mark of a prisoner waiting to be freed. The conspirators realized that to strike against the emperor without the sun would be futile. The people might see it as treason. But if the sun himself turned, then rebellion would have a face blessed by divine blood. Letters circulated, written in invisible ink, promising him freedom, autonomy, even the love of the people, if he broke the chains of his father's spell. One surviving letter, found centuries later in the ruins of a senator's estate, reads, "You have been made bride, not prince. You have been placed as ornament, not ruler. Yet you are still the blood of the empire, and in your hand rests the sword that may free us all. Your father is not eternal. His breath stinks of age, his flesh trembles with decay. Unite with us, and we will tear him down. Remain silent, and you will perish as his shadow." Whether the son answered this letter, history cannot say. But soon after, a chain of events began that suggests he did not entirely ignore the voices of the conspirators. During a great feast, where the emperor sat surrounded by gold and music, a senator attempted to slip poison into his cup. The attempt failed. A loyal servant caught the scent and screamed before the cup touched imperial lips. The senator was dragged away, screaming curses, and executed before dawn. His family disappeared into the night, their estates seized by the crown. Yet even in death, his act spread panic. If one dared strike, others would follow. The emperor responded with ferocity. He unleashed a purge across the court, accusing dozens of treachery. Senators were strangled, generals demoted, priests silenced. Blood stained the marble floors of the palace. Fear grew so suffocating that even the loyal trembled, for loyalty itself could be mistaken for deceit. But the purge did not stop the conspiracies. It only deepened them. Now daggers were hidden not only in the hands of enemies, but also among supposed friends. One general, once loyal, began plotting with foreign envoys. Another senator bribed servants to watch the emperor's movements. Every whisper of dissent was carried like a spark, ready to ignite the empire into flames. Amid this storm, the emperor grew increasingly obsessed with his son. Some chronicles claim he forbade the young man from appearing in public without him. Others state that he forced the son to share his bedchamber nightly, not merely as heir, but as proof of their eternal union. This unnatural bond turned the son into both a prisoner and a symbol of his father's paranoia. One chilling account describes a scene witnessed by a palace servant. The emperor clutched his son's hand before the council, declaring, "He is my flesh, my soul. To strike him is to strike me." Yet I saw in the young man's eyes no devotion, only despair. He looked like a bird with wings broken, forced to stand as if he still soared. It was in this climate of suffocation that the most daring conspiracy was born. A faction of senators, generals, and priests decided that assassination was the only path left. They plotted to strike not in secret, but during a ritual itself, when the emperor would be surrounded by sacred flames and distracted by ceremony. The plan was audacious, to turn his own heavenly marriage into a funeral. The son's role in this plot remains the most contested mystery of all. Did he know of it? Did he secretly consent, desperate to be free? Or was he merely a pawn, unaware that daggers were already sharpened for his father's heart? Historians still debate, and the surviving records are contradictory. Some claim the son himself loosened the guards. Others insist he wept as the conspirators moved into place. What is certain is that on the appointed night, the air of the palace grew heavy with dread. Torches burned brighter, as though sensing the blood about to be spilled. The emperor, robed in gold, stood at the altar with his son beside him. Incense filled the air, drums echoed like beating hearts, and all eyes turned to the moment when heaven itself was to be invoked again. But heaven did not descend. Instead, steel did. Update 3. The night chosen for the second heavenly marriage ritual was meant to demonstrate the emperor's invincible authority. He believed that by repeating the ceremony, he would silence doubts and remind the empire that he and his son were bound by a union stronger than death. But fate has its own rituals, and this night would become a marriage not of heaven and earth, but of power and blood. The palace was drenched in opulence. Torches burned in silver stands, their flames dancing across mosaics of gods and stars. Incense spiraled upward, choking the air with sweetness so thick it stung the throat. The emperor appeared in robes heavy with jewels, a crown of sun rays upon his head. At his side stood his son, pale and silent, his eyes lowered as though he carried chains, invisible to all but himself. The conspirators had chosen this moment well. They knew the emperor would be surrounded by priests and guards, but also that ritual demanded concentration, lowering his defenses. Daggers gleamed beneath the sleeves of senators, and soldiers, secretly bribed, shifted nervously among the ranks of loyal guards. The air itself trembled with tension, as though the walls of the palace anticipated the storm about to erupt. The ceremony began. The emperor raised his hands, proclaiming the eternal bond of father and son. His voice boomed like thunder. "He is my flesh. He is my soul. Through him I shall never die, for in him burns the second sun." The crowd of attendants bowed, but their faces were masks of fear, not devotion. The son stood motionless, like a statue, his lips pressed tightly together. The emperor placed a garland of sacred flowers upon his head, a gesture of union, but to many watching it, resembled a crown of thorns. Then came the moment of offering, when incense, blood, and vows were to be mingled in the sacred flame. The emperor turned his gaze upward, stretching his arms wide as though to embrace the heavens, and in that instant, the conspirators struck. Steel flashed in the torchlight. A senator lunged forward with a dagger aimed at the emperor's chest. A soldier slashed at his side. Chaos erupted in screams and the clash of blades. Priests scattered like frightened birds. Servants fell to their knees, and the hall that had echoed with hymns now thundered with the sound of murder. The emperor, despite his age, did not fall easily. Chronicles say he seized the arm of his attacker, twisting it with a strength unnatural for a man of his years. Some claim he shouted words of curse, calling upon gods to strike down the traitors. Blood spilled upon the altar, but it was not yet his own. He fought like a beast cornered, his golden robes soaked crimson. But numbers triumphed over strength. One blade pierced his side, another his throat. The emperor staggered, clutching the altar as though it might save him. Witnesses swore that in his final breath, he turned to his son and cried, "Do not betray me." Then he fell, his crown rolling across the floor, scattering jewels that glittered like drops of frozen blood. The hall fell into silence, broken only by the hiss of incense fading into ash. The conspirators stood triumphant, but triumph soon turned to uncertainty. All eyes turned to the son, the boy who had been both bride and heir, bound to his father in ritual and now freed by death. Would he stand with the conspirators, claiming his throne? Or would he condemn them as murderers of his blood? The sources diverge here, as though history itself could not bear to agree. Some chronicles say the son collapsed in tears, unable to speak, paralyzed by the horror of his father's slaughter. Others insist he whispered a single word, freedom, before turning his back on the corpse. A few darker accounts claim he himself took up a dagger and struck the final blow, proving that no chains, not even heavenly ones, could bind him forever. What is certain is that his reign, brief and tragic, never found stability. The conspirators who had elevated him soon turned against one another. Generals quarreled over command. Senators grasped for influence. Priests argued over whether the new ruler was blessed or cursed. The empire that had once seemed eternal fractured into rival factions. Civil war followed, and with it famine, plague, and the slow crumbling of imperial grandeur. The heavenly marriage, meant to secure eternity, had instead birthed decay. The emperor's obsession with binding his son had unleashed forces that destroyed not only himself, but the unity of his realm. What was intended as a sacred mystery became a curse whispered for generations. Monks who recorded these events centuries later called it a lesson in hubris, the folly of rulers who believed themselves gods. They wrote, "He sought to live forever by uniting with his blood. Instead, he ensured his name would live in infamy." His marriage was not of heaven, but of shadows. His legacy is not eternity, but warning. Yet others, especially mystics and esoteric sects, interpreted the story differently. They believed the emperor had indeed achieved a form of immortality. In their writings, the union of father and son was not destroyed by assassination, but completed through blood. They claimed that the emperor's soul fused with his son in the moment of death, and that his spirit continued to rule unseen, haunting the palace halls. Some cults even worshipped him as the twice-born son, a god who conquered mortality through ritual and sacrifice. And so the truth remains blurred, like smoke rising from a burnt manuscript. Was the emperor a mad tyrant who corrupted his son and destroyed his empire, or was he a visionary who attempted to pierce the veil of death, only to be undone by mortal fear and betrayal? As historians, we can only follow the fragments left behind, the testimonies of priests, the letters of conspirators, the whispers of servants, and the sermons of monks. Together, they form a mosaic not of certainty, but of tragedy. For what endures is not the emperor's eternity, but the echo of his obsession, carved into the memory of history like a scar that refuses to heal. Thus ends the tale of the emperor who married his son, the ritual that sought heaven but brought ruin. A story of ambition disguised as piety, of love twisted into power, of conspiracies born in silence and ended in blood. The empire survived in name for a time, but it was never the same. The heavenly marriage became a forbidden subject, whispered only as a warning. And yet, as long as men hunger for eternity and fear death's silence, perhaps such rituals will always lurk in the shadows, waiting for another emperor, another son, another night of blood and ashes.